Okay, Weapon Collector's YouTube 10 pound, as in currency, weapon making challenge. This was a lot of fun to partake in. I started with this 20-year-old piece of PVC pipe, sorry to the spider living in it, that I found in my garage. Pretty sure it was from the previous owners of the house. And, just cut it down. I knew I wanted to make a baton-type weapon, and one that took advantage of my research and writing, right, as a weapons author, but I wasn't sure exactly what that meant. So here's how I started. Had some twine lying around. Elmer's glue was also in the house, but I did buy some epoxy putty. Took one trip to the hardware store, got that. Obviously, you know the pipe, now it's cleaned out on the inside. And then these steel plugs. And what surprised me, I guess I didn't pay enough attention, they had holes in them, and that was not my plan, because they were supposed to be plugs. So you'll see how I dealt with that. Anyway, some very patient gluing and twine wrapping was next. Got that idea from Mike, Weapon Collector. And here we go. Finally starting to get there. Really took a long time. It's a messy process and a slow process, but I think it looks great and it can really be done on the cheap. The thing is, I'm using it for the striking portion and not just the grip, so that's real unusual. And this hole presents a big problem because what's even more unusual is that my baton here, my truncheon, is going to be filled with loose metal shot. Well, the shot is going to go flying out of there real quick if I don't plug it up somehow, so I decided to use the putty for that. I knew it'd come in handy for something, but to help, I managed to fit a dime into each of them, so I guess that adds to my cost. But only 20 cents, so still under the 10 pound, roughly $12, $13 limit. Once I finally finished gluing the twine onto the entire thing, then I just sawed it off wherever it was convenient. And here's the missing ingredient. I've mentioned it, but I didn't show it before, which is the shot. They're actual BBs. But yeah, this is a loose filling on the inside, hard shell exterior, with a thin softening cover on the outside club. Such a forgotten impact weapon, it doesn't even have a name, but it's part of what I resurrected from the ash heap of history in my book. And the whole concept of the design is not to do as much damage as possible, but to knock somebody out or disable them without breaking bone. And that's part of why I only had actually a few inches of shot in here. It's not as full as it looks. One of the challenges was I had to protect the drying putty on the ends, so here I'm doing this ramrod style thing because I had a wad of paper holding the shot, and I pushed it to about halfway down. That way the loose metal load is suspended halfway in between while the first end dries, and now here's my epoxy putty and plug going in the second. And by the way, the 3-in-1, which was also lying around the house, was another ingredient. I poured some in to keep the BBs moving loosely. Over time, didn't think that would hurt, so you might be able to hear the load moving around, but you'll definitely hear it later. What I had to do here was tighten these bolts in as much as I possibly could. Remember, this is a challenge with a low price limit, so obviously I could do a better version with, like, interior threaded pipe, a metal pipe, that kind of thing, and really lock it in. This is more of a friction plug, so I tightened it as much as I could. My hands were aching, but I put some more glue on the threading, and I had the putty, as you saw, kind of a cone head shape. Really, that's to help more cushion the load when it bounces around inside there than anything else, but I figured it couldn't hurt in terms of keeping the bolt in place either. And after all that arduous work, I found that I could not get the bolts to go all the way in to put them flush. So that was a little annoying, but not that big of a deal. I had to do some extra twine wrapping to make up for that. That obviously meant more gluing, more wrapping, but not that much. And here's the gap, as you can see. That's from before I filled the space, as mentioned. You can also see here that I have room to improve on the finishing. Like I can snip stray strands of twine, maybe put a coat of varnish on it. But it looks and feels great, in my opinion anyway, as is. So, funny enough, I did not plan this, but you can see the face of both dimes peeking out from either end. And now you get to hear the filling, as I mentioned. And remember, there's not much of it. This is a mostly empty tube. And this really changes the feel over a typical baton. It's constantly shifting. If you hold it like this, it's completely weighted on the bottom, right? If you dip one end like that, then you're effectively loading your weapon before a strike, so I thought that's really interesting. Let's get a close-up of the exterior, and remember, it softens the blow on purpose. That plus the shifting internals create what I call the soft sap effect, which you know about if you've seen my other videos or read my book. And you see there how it kind of sticks to the target. That's what happens. It's like, I also point this out in my book, it's like a dead blow hammer, a modern tool you can read about. So this thing is a joy to play with. Once you're swinging it, it's more like a slung shot. It's more like a rock on the end of a rope in a way. But before you get your swings really going, remember the center of gravity just shifts wildly depending on how you're holding it. For instance, that reverse strike right there did not feel good. The load doesn't have enough time to make it to the head of the strike when I do that. That one there, however, felt great. It loaded up in plenty of time. Remember, I'm trying to get the weight from there to there before impact. So it's like a blackjack, especially a flexible blackjack, or a slung shot or a soft sap, or even a whip, where your timing is going to dictate how effective the strike is. So just playing around with moving off of the center line and striking the opponent. It's worth noting that this is probably the first time in over a century that someone has made and experimented with an impact weapon like this. Now let's see what kind of impact we can impart on my trusty medicine ball. Not bad, you know, that's very comparable to what I did with my loaded shillelagh and other weapons which were twice as long as this little guy. Against the exact same target, freestanding, although I was striking at a different elevation. Thought my shirt was funny. Murder by Death, great band, and notice one of the weapons on the shirt is the lead pipe. So the original version of this weapon, this Victorian era, never-do-well, you know, Peaky Blinder, Apache, Nine Rabbit type weapon, would have been a thin lead pipe. So again, you're not trying to create something that could bash through concrete. A very thin lead pipe filled with shot and wrapped in something. The specific example in my book is eel skin. So the thick PVC, relatively thick, I think was a good substitute for the lead, because again, lead has an internal softness to it as well. So again, you're not trying to do just the hardest material you can possibly find. But I understand lead pipes by street toughs because it was just so common. Anyway, the point of the overall design with weapons like this, whether soft sap or this particular, I'm calling it a rain stick here, was to sink the energy deep into the target while minimizing the surface level damage. There are more surprises to be had in handling one of these. It's great to have this to experiment with. Short snapping strikes are interesting because the load is completely at the bottom, so the part you're striking with is almost completely unweighted, so it moves out to the target and returns very quickly while sacrificing a lot of power. Like I talked about, timing is important, like striking my palm here. If you don't get the timing right, it's like a surfer missing the wave. And as mentioned, that relates to other flexible saps and blackjacks. And that level of nuance gets left out a lot of discussions where it's usually about, well, which kind hits harder. There are actually different kinds of impact, and which one is quote-unquote better, depends on the situation and the user. I thought this would work pretty well. In slow motion you can really hear sound, so listen to what is hopefully the optimization of the internal load when I swing this thing. This is pretty neat. You can even hear the shot moving from just slight adjustments before I swing. Listen in a second when it's upright, how you can hear the final bits dropping. And let's give it one final go. Notice that you heard the load kind of lock in place after enough swinging. And then it resets after, once the weapon slows. Well, there it is. I'm real happy with how this turned out. I want to try to make better versions. This is just a prototype. I'm calling it the Rain Stick. Originally it would have been called a Sand Club, even though it has no sand in it. It's complicated. You can read about why in the oft-mentioned book. So thanks to Weapon Collector Mike for this idea. Forced me to do something I was kind of thinking about anyway, but probably wouldn't have gotten around to. So, bye.